Hola, va a empezar ya la charla de Gareth Damian, no Gareth Evans, Gareth Damian. Y bueno, que se presente él, que ha hecho cosas muy chulas, ¿no?
Okay, I see my slide. Hello, it's very loud in here, so I'm going to do my best to talk loudly with the help of this microphone. Let's start there. I'm Gareth Damian Martin. I'm the creator of the Citizen Sleeper series. I also made a game called In Other Waters. I develop under the studio name Jump Over the Age, but I kind of call myself a solo developer because basically on Citizen Sleeper I also had Guillaume Saint-Gelon, who's the character artist, and Amos Roddy, who's the composer and sound designer. But they work outside Unity and the project. So thank you. If you don't want to call me a solo developer, you want to call me a team developer, that's fine, but it's just the way I think about my work. I don't know if you know what Citizen Sleeper is, but I thought the best thing to do to begin is just to show you a trailer, because it can be a little hard to explain when people don't know what it is. So you guys can roll the trailer if you're able. Otherwise, it's a lot of me describing things that you're not going to understand at all until you look at the Steam page later. Or maybe not. Do I have to press it? Nope. Okay. It's not working? Okay. Or maybe I'm not going to show you a trailer. Okay, well, if you don't know what Citizen Sleeper is, maybe you're going to catch up. But it's a game where you can see at the top you have a series of dice. And each day in this game, you roll a number of dice, and those dice decide what actions you can take. You play as an android who was in indentured servitude to a corporation. This android has a human consciousness that's been transmitted into that android body, and they're made to work for the corporation, but they've escaped, and their body is falling apart. And that's why the dice decide each day what you're able to do. I recommend, if you don't know what it is, you go to the Steam page. It's going to be a lot easier than me explaining the whole thing. But today I want to talk about the sequel, Citizen Sleeper 2, which came out January 31st. And it's a little difficult for me so soon after the launch to really pick it apart. I have so many things tied up in the sequel, but I wanted to try to find a paradigm that might help all of you find a way through what I'm saying. So what I'm kind of thinking about is this idea of the sequel both as a project and as a response. So when I'm thinking about the sequel as a project, that's when, as a solo developer, I'm in my project manager personality, and I'm thinking about the objectives and the design and the marketing. I'm thinking about the opportunities of making a sequel, but also the risks. And that's kind of the part of me that sits there and does all the schedules and tells the other me what to do when it's Monday morning and they have to get up and decide what to do. And that other me is the sequel as response. So for me, that's much more the emotional part of the game development, the creative part, the artistic part, but also why I made a sequel, right? For me, the sequel is completely encapsulated in this idea of the response, as both responding to the success of Citizen Sleeper 1, as responding to games and media which had kind of come into my world and been part of my life. And the game itself is a response to crisis and the idea of crisis, and whether crisis is a negative or productive force. And then also the game in itself, as I made it, became a bigger response, something I came to think of as the bounce back, which I'm going to get into. And I also want to say, in case you haven't can't tell by how messy it's been already, but things may be messier. What I mean by that is that this is a development process that is mostly taking place inside my mind, And therefore, when I'm sitting here in front of all of you, it may sound like, oh, that guy, he had it all figured out, like just this. But it's not true. I just want to make sure that everybody understands we all have these really messy processes. And for me, I'm just trying to separate it out in order to help everybody understand. But I don't want you to get the impression that like there's some kind of rule book that we can just follow to make these kind of projects. So why I set out to make Citizen Sleeper 2 in the first place is, and this is me in like project mode, is thinking that the conditions were right? And what does that mean? So after Citizen Sleeper 1, we had this kind of huge interest in the game. For me, Citizen Sleeper 1, it sounds crazy when I say it, but I thought it was not going to be successful. I thought that it was too strange, it was too unusual, I thought it was for a niche audience. I thought maybe it would sell less than my previous game, but I was very wrong. And a lot of people really connected to the game and really enjoyed the way it brought tabletop ideas, ideas from role-playing games into video games. So I saw this, and I saw this as an opportunity because I had all of these external factors telling me, okay, Citizen Sleeper, it's super interesting, it's something we really care about. And internally, for me, I had all of this energy from trying to think about how to bring ideas from tabletop gaming into video games. And I wasn't finished. Citizen Sleeper was just me beginning this process of saying, okay, maybe we could try this. And when everyone said, yeah, that works, I'm like, oh, okay, I have a whole load of more ideas. Like, let me get them out of the cupboard and show them to you. So I really felt like it was impossible for me not to make the sequel. I was working on a DLC for the first game, and that just generated more and more ideas for me. So for me, that was an easy decision to make, to move into the sequel. I want to talk a little bit in a super project manager mode, because I think something that we often don't talk about in games is project design. So often, people's project design for a video game is, I want to like make it as popular as possible, and I want to make it like however long it takes to make, which is a really bad starting point for making a video game. I think it's really good from the very beginning to have a sense of what the scope of your project is, what the scale is, but also what your objectives are within that, because there's absolutely no way that you're going to be able to just make like a 90% Metacritic game or whatever. You have to have a really specific idea of what it is that you're chasing. So for me, for Citizen Sleeper 2, the first game took 2 years to make, and I really didn't want to spend more than 2 years making the sequel, because I had this idea it was like the second season of a TV show, and I didn't want that feeling where people are just waiting and waiting forever for it to come out, and then I get lost in the weeds, and I'm not sure, like, when is it ready? I wanted it to have this really clear structure. I also had all of this evidence for me that showed that I could achieve it within this goal. I made the first game within that time, and I also had the advantage now of having built the project, and I could branch from that project. I could build on top of that project. I had the collaborators, I had the tools, I had the core. So the objectives I put into that were really that I wanted to think about responding to some of the criticism of Citizen Sleeper by making a stronger mechanical base for the role-playing experience. So a big part of Citizen Sleeper is the role-playing experience, meaning the player putting their emotional energy into the character and finding their place in the game and the characters they're interested in and the stories they want to follow. And I found a lot of players really engaged with that, but some players really, I think, felt they didn't have enough mechanical support for that, meaning that their relationships with their characters were kind of non-mechanicalized, they were not systemic, and the relationship with money and just making ends meet was very systemic. So this was something I wanted to think about more ways to bring the emotional side of the game into focus. I also really wanted to have the opportunity to try and make something in the ship and crew genre of video games and also media more generally. So like Cowboy Bebop or, I don't know, like Deep Space Nine or Farscape or something like this. I always loved these stories, but I have a lot of issues with various parts of them. And so it felt like an opportunity to try to build a project around giving my take on this genre. But this is all very project-y, I guess. And so I just want to cover a little bit the core design for how I approach this. In this talk, generally, I'm going to try to cover as much as possible of the whole process of making the game. We'll see how long that takes me and whether that was a good idea or not. But I'm not going to go into super high level of depth with the game design, but I want to just cover what the top level additions from 1 to 2 were. The top of it was the crisis system. So I said earlier I was thinking about this idea of crisis and responding to crisis in the game's themes and in the idea of what I wanted the player to be engaging with. They're in a solar system in crisis in the game, and they're in this place where there are these 2 corporations fighting out against each other, and they are just a small entity within that world, trying to stay on the run from the mob boss who was trying to control them, and also trying to build a life for themselves. So for me, this idea of crisis became the big theme, because I also, want to talk. Citizen Sleeper games are also about, bigger issues and bigger themes that are in our society and that we see around us. And for me, I hear the word crisis, probably you do too, like 500 times a day. And so I wanted to have the opportunity to explore this. So for thinking about crisis, I kind of drawing on like mechanical and thematic things. But when I'm coming to game design, I'm really trying to focus on the mechanical. One thing that I really wanted to have in Citizen Sleeper 1 and never came in, and that I wanted to put in this game, was an idea from a game called Pandemic: The Cure, which is a dice game where each turn you roll your dice, and they tell you like what actions you can do. But on those dice, they also have like a bad symbol. And you can re-roll your dice as many times as you want, but if you roll the bad symbol, your turn is over, and the disease in Pandemic progresses. So this is like a board game if you don't know Pandemic. And I really love this design, which was all about pushing your luck within a very simple system to try and get to balance your intended outcomes with the potential of a looming crisis occurring. So this became an inspiration for how the dice system works. So in Citizen Sleeper 2, with your dice, you see at the top there's like a little red dots. The more like stress you accrue in the game, when you roll your dice at the start of the cycle, they may break. So you see there's like, they're not highlighted yet, but there's a little 1 there, there's like a 2 there. So then when you get higher stress, as you roll the dice like take damage, which is at the bottom there, and ultimately break. So this represents a change from the first game, because in the first game you had this system where your body was declining on like a consistent and like ominous path. In this game, your decline is potential. You take on stress, and then when you roll your dice, you discover what the impact of that stress is going to be on your body. And for me, this was a core part of representing crisis, because crisis is not about the slow decline. It's about these moments of sudden shift that create a difference both in people's lives and in the world. Also, a thing that became really important in the game, a lot of people associated the dice system in Citizen Sleeper 1 with what people call spoon theory, which is this idea when you have a chronic illness, you represent the energy you have to give each day by like a number of spoons. So you talk, it's a way of speaking when you have a chronic illness, that you might say, I don't have enough energy for this, and the concept that each day you only have so much energy to give. But I think it's something that's relatable for all people, not just for people with chronic illnesses. And so I thought more about how I wanted the dice to represent the character, thinking about this idea of connecting the mechanics and the emotion really fully. The dice in Citizen Sleeper 2, when you look at them, they tell you a lot of things about where your body is at and what is happening. So we have glitch dice. You can take on glitch in this little thing here, and then they may convert to these glitch dice here. And so when you look at your dice, you can see like, oh yeah, like I've got all these glitches in my body, and I've taken damage to my dice health here, and and it becomes each day when the player is playing, they're seeing their own state and the potential stress and crisis, everything in this space. I wanted there to be like a mechanical space where the player is looking at it and constantly negotiating it. And then the final part of this kind of crisis system was within the game, you go on these contracts. And within these contracts, you have stress for the contract itself. So in this case, you have like a derelict ship, and that derelict ship is falling apart. And so we track that in the game, and we have these little exclamation marks where as that gets more stressed, it triggers additional crises. And each time a crisis is active, it increases the stress gain. And this is very similar to how the dice system works, in the sense that it's all about building up this potential harm, this potential energy that then can suddenly turn in a downward spiral and can suddenly twist against the player. It's intentionally not fair to speak, in a kind of game terms. It's intentionally a system which is about the player realizing that they have this storm cloud hanging over them, and they're walking deeper and deeper under it, and their aim is to get out of the other side unscathed, but they know at any time it could break and ruin everything. And so this was the kind of mechanical structures around Crisis for the game. I also introduced a crew with Citizen Sleeper 2. There was a bullet point earlier where I put this thing, references and anti-references. I say this because so often I have references in my games where I'm taking inspiration from them, but I'm also taking inspiration from what they do badly. I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, okay, this game, I'm drawing on all of its bad side to energize my design. And for me, Mass Effect 2 is both a reference and an anti-reference. I hate how much it's about a super cop who goes around the world making judgments on everybody, but I love its focus on characters and building a community on a ship. I hate this, you can't really see it, but this is Gareth just saying, I'm in the middle of some calibrations. Every time you talk to him, if you've exhausted his story, he's like, I'm in the middle of some calibrations. So this was a real core focus point for me, is I wanted to make sure I was making something which took the best ideas from something like Mass Effect 2, but also complicated some of the weaknesses. And one of the main ideas behind that was to give the crew agency. So they don't just hang around in the basement of your ship, waiting for you to tell them and come talk to them. I always had this horrible feeling in Mass Effect that you're a really horrible boss who goes around the office trying to get a date from one of your coworkers, right? He has this horrible atmosphere. You're going to their desk and you're like, oh, what are you working on, And it's so disgusting. So for me, I really wanted this feeling that the crew would come and go. And in Citizen Sleeper 2, you'll find that, your pilot might go off on his own journey when you arrive at a place. He might disappear and you can't fly your ship until he comes back. The characters are not hanging around in the ship for you to talk to them. And I think this was a tricky decision because a lot of players expect that in this kind of game, you have these characters and you can kind of own them and they live in your basement and you can talk to them whenever you want. But that's not how it is in real life and with our friends. And so I wanted to activate this feeling of agency and that the characters were real. And then finally, we have this really fun connection that happened in the game where when you place dice, you have dice for each of your crew members when you go on a contract. And when you place them, they might react to what you're doing with a little response. Here, Eugene's saying, don't worry, even though I'm bad at this task, I can take it, I'm tough. And this actually came from me presenting the game to press. So the first time I presented the game to press, I found myself narrating what the characters were doing. I was like, oh, if you put that dice there, Ginny, she won't like that because she's a hacker, and if you try to get her to cut open that airlock with a blowtorch, that's not going to be her favorite thing. And I realized I have to take this narration that I'm doing and I have to put it in the game. So this became a really interesting process that emerged out of just presenting to press. So this is when I'm talking about things being messy. I didn't necessarily have this idea from the beginning, but it's something that emerged through the game. And then also, the final thing that the game has, which Citizen Sleeper 1 doesn't have, is this ship and map structure. One thing that I really love to do with my games is I love to find ways to take other people's games and then hack bits out of them and make my own game in them. So when I started making Citizen Sleeper 2, I actually got a copy of Star Wars Outer Rim, which is this ship and crew smuggling game, board game. And I basically tried to write myself a separate rule set for Star Wars Outer Rim that would allow me to play it like I want to play Citizen Sleeper 2. So I added a fuel and supplies stats. I added narrative structures. I added clocks. I added all kinds of things. And I think this was has been a really effective thing in all of my work, is actually going and using paper prototyping, but also using existing structures and trying to build on top of them. Absolutely nobody can stop you from deciding that you're going to change the rules to a pen and paper game. I know it sounds silly, but it can be a really powerful way of creating ideas. Also drawing from tabletop. In Citizen Sleeper 2, you have this structure where you go out on contracts and you come back to rest. And this was really drawing on Blades in the Dark, which is an amazing tabletop game. And I really wanted this structure of downtime and contracts. So this was another part of something that I really wanted to bring to the game, because for me, this idea of crisis matched really nicely with the idea of recovery and managing harm. And so a lot of the structures in the game are designed around, for example, the glitch dice, which I showed you earlier. They occur when you try to heal your robot body. You might heal it poorly, and then you take on more glitches. And those glitches force you to take time to recover from the contract you were on. And so I'm trying to find ways of engaging the player mechanically in the experience I want. I don't just want them, I can tell them like, oh, this character thinks you should rest. But if I make it mechanically necessary for the player to rest after each job, I think it creates a stronger emotional connection. And then the final thing in the design is I wanted to, in Citizen Sleeper 1, everything takes place on a one space station. And the thing with that is that means you can see all the potential threads at the same time. I think it can often become quite overwhelming, especially if you just open all of the doors. You kind of try every single character and you try every single thing. You end up with this crazy space station full of loads of things that you don't know, okay, I never want to do that thing with that character, but the icon's going to stay there forever. So something in Citizen Sleeper 2 I really wanted to explore was how I could use the physical space to actually guide the player's choice. And the idea that, like, okay, this player never passed through this place, they would never meet those characters, and so that place still has potential, and it doesn't overcrowd the game. I wanted the player to try to cut a path through the space. So those were the kind of core design structures. Again, it's like a super fast, just like through the design, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how the design process was working. Because for me, the core focus of this kind of process is really an emotional design. I know that not every game is designed in this way, but for me, when I'm thinking about my games, I'm trying to think about the emotional position that I'm putting the player in. I think the more that I've run tabletop games and been a DM and a GM and having players at the table and running games for them, the more I think about this, because that's really your focus also when you're running those games. Okay, you have to do all the maths, you have to calculate all the stats, but the aim of doing that is to put the player in a place where they have a moment of realization or emotion or a feeling where they feel connected in that kind of sparky way to the character in the game. So for me, there were these kind of core elements of this idea of bouncing back or people coming together within a crisis, and then also your body in crisis, the system itself in crisis. And I wanted specifically to have players have this experience where they scrape through or where they fail. I never want anybody's playthrough of Citizen Sleeper 2 to be like, yeah, I beat every single contract with like time to spare. I specifically designed systems to not allow that kind of control. Instead, I want this emotional experience where I'm seeding in the players a feeling of connection through the difficulty that they went through a contract with certain characters they took with them, and that contract went so bad, and that's now like a memory they have with those characters, and then when they take those characters on another contract and they succeed, or they find a way through, or they make that last-minute dice roll, the bond with those characters is forged in something really real for the player. It's not just me telling you, hey, this guy here's your friend. It's the building of a real friendship, for me at least. Now I want to cover a little bit of the process of making the game as well, because it's all well and good to have this like really great design idea and document, but we have to make games. And for me, I make games, at this desk with this chair, trying to surround myself with as many of these things which inspire me as possible, because otherwise I will forget. I'll forget those things I just showed you on that slide, that I need to remember these emotional designs. I need to put up Post-it notes for myself which say on them crisis to loop through it. And for me, it's a really personal process because I'm mostly making these games on my own. And I think for one of the big experiments of Citizen Sleeper 2 for me was to try to activate this idea from tabletop games, which is a principle, which is the idea of playing to find out what happens. So a lot of contemporary tabletop games will have at the front of the book, one of the principles is play to find out. And for me, I wanted to keep this energy in the game. So when I started making the game, I didn't have the endings of the game and all of the characters' endings laid out. I really wanted this process of sitting down every day, working on the game, and discovering where these stories were going to go, because I wanted to translate this feeling that you have when you play a tabletop game with a GM, and the story kind of gathers pace and weight and meaning and emotion as it proceeds. I wanted to try to get that in the game. And for me, the best way to capture something is through a process, not through an end product, right? It's not just look at, okay, Mass Effect 2. I'll look at Mass Effect 2 really hard, and then I'll be able to make it. It's much easier to recreate something if you have a process that you know. So I really stuck to this process, but I would say that I had some advantages in doing it. As a solo developer, I can kind of shift things very quickly. I can abandon things. I can leave things behind. But it's, I think it can be really rich. And I actually, throughout the development of Citizen Sleeper 2, when I was trying to think of ideas, I reached for, tabletop games. I reached for decks of cards. I reached for prompt books, rolled dice, saw what could come out of other systems, saw what ideas I could generate. I was always trying to keep this live element. And this became a really big part of the game, because I always had in my head this idea for the beginning of Citizen Sleeper 2, that it would always be the sleeper is woken up in the middle of a surgery, and that surgery is interrupted, and all of the changes to their body that they were trying to manifest in order to free themselves from the corporation they worked for, they'd all been stopped, and they were in this point of crisis in the middle of something. And this came from my own experiences of having surgery and the feeling of disconnection that you have, even in the weeks after having a surgery, where you wake up and you're kind of finding things about your body have changed. And I think for me, I ended up with this really terrible linking of circumstances where in the middle of Citizen Sleeper 2's development, I had to have surgery, and I had to have the same surgery twice, because it was a surgery where if it doesn't heal correctly, they have to just do the whole thing again. And this really drilled into my mind, and I think this is because I had this mentality of playing to find out. I was discovering the game, and these events of the surgery really started to wheedle away in my brain. This idea of the same surgery twice, just as a concept, became like something really interesting to me. And the idea of trying to come back from recovery for a surgery and still finish the video game also started to connect to me and the themes of the game. And so there was this line in one of the trailers we made where Seraphine, one of the characters, says, "We have to bounce back." And this became a kind of mantra for me throughout the process. This idea of we have to bounce back, that this would be what I was doing as a developer, but it's also what I'm asking the player to do in the game. I'm asking them to trust me, that I'm going to take them in this story where they will get to come back. They will get to go again. They will get to reach a conclusion, even if it's through failure. And so this became the real core of the game for me. And the game actually, spoilers, in some ways is set between two surgeries to some extent, and about the kind of emotional arc between those two. And I think, for me, it felt like a big reward for going through hardship was finding a way to transform it into the energy that I needed to finish the game. Leaving myself open to that was a big part of making the game. The final bit I want to talk about, I have no idea how much time I'm spending. The final bit I want to talk about is talking about this game, because a big part of making this game was that we basically announced it 2 months after I started development on it. So to give you a timeline, we launched Citizen Sleeper 1 in 2022. I then spent a year making 3 DLC episodes, the last of which launched in 30th of March 2023. And I knew at that point I was already, okay, this is going to become a sequel. And I wanted this feeling of, okay, this is a continuous story. Don't forget Citizen Sleeper, It's not just that cool indie game you played and then you forget about it and you never think about it again. I want this to be a growing world. I want it to be alive. And so we had to announce it as soon as possible because I wanted that energy. But I think I underestimated how much effort it would take to actually talk about the game constantly while you're also making it. So we had to come up with a lot of ways to keep the energy around the game throughout development. There's a few of them here, but I'm going to go in a little more detail. So one of the things we did is we had a cinematic trailer, which was in itself like I can't play it to you now, but you should watch it. It's very cool. I didn't really make it. It's Guillaume Saint-Gelon, the incredible comic book artist, and another animator also called Guillaume, who worked on it together, and I directed it. Now, I know lots of people out there are like, they hate cinematic trailers, which I also do, right? It's when a game is revealed and you're like, okay, cool, you spent a lot of money to make a cinematic trailer. But actually, for us, it was absolute oxygen because we needed to make as many moments where we could talk about this game as possible throughout these 2 years. And I think, creating this like cinematic trailer and creating this little mini short film that was all about what are the values of this world and the structure became really important. We also kind of had this whole process. My big concept with this 2-year process would be that the game would be an event game. And the only way to like make it into an event was to constantly create things happening around it, right? And so this was the process. So we were very lucky to get an Edge cover from Edge magazine in the UK. This was we actually slipped in because somebody else like dropped out at the last minute. But the really funny thing is that this artwork, which was created in, I think, about 3 days by Guillaume, me and him were just smashing ideas together because Edge magazine said, okay, someone dropped out, you can jump in. This became the key art for the game. And so I think, again, like I was talking about this process of remaining open to the process, our process of talking about the game, and I say talking about the game rather than marketing, because for me, marketing makes it very cold, and it's not cold, it's a very emotional experience for me. But we were staying open to these processes and trying to snowball this material. Another project we did was an actual play of another person's tabletop role-playing game, but we reset it within the Citizen Sleeper world. Again, another piece of content that, for us, told everybody so much about what our game was and connected up the tabletop audiences and the video game audiences, but it didn't involve us having to show more of the game, which is great when you're busy making it at the same time. I also, crazily, ran an interstitial text series called Helian Dispatches, which were these small text emails that you could receive between Citizen Sleeper 1 and Citizen Sleeper 2 that covered the time skip between the games. And constantly, we had this process of revising our Steam page, of focusing on talking about the game. And for me, the process of talking about this game and making this game became completely interwoven. And I think it was really powerful for the game. I think it created this real sense of energy behind the game. But it also meant that we were really very honestly kind of speaking about the game and working with what came back from the feedback. And like I was talking about earlier, the whole sequel was structured in some sense as a response. The actual process of making the game is I constantly was thinking about this idea of how can I respond, how can I remain open to what's being said, to what's coming in from the outside. And one of the examples for that was, between the time Citizen Sleeper 1 launched and Citizen Sleeper 2 launched, a very small game you might have heard of called Baldur's Gate 3 launched and completely transformed the idea of dice in a video game, because all of a sudden we had millions of people who now played a video game with dice in it who'd never played an RPG or a video game with dice in it. So again, we changed the way we talked about the game. We'd never have dared to talk about Citizen Sleeper 1 as a dice-driven RPG because nobody would know what that meant. But the more and more that I worked through the process and discovered this also way of mechanicalizing the role-playing, of tying everything to the dice, and the dice being that kind of emotional heart of the game, the dice-driven RPG became the kind of call that I wanted to make when we went into our final part of talking about the game. So the game released on the 31st of January, and I just want to cover a little bit of like the response. We sold 2.5 times what we sold on Citizen Sleeper, which was a shock for us, to be honest. You don't usually expect a sequel always does better than the first game. It can often be less because people feel they have to get in. But we also, one of the most exciting things we had was we had the biggest ever day for Citizen Sleeper players, actually. We'd never had more people playing Citizen Sleeper 1 than when Citizen Sleeper 2 came out. And so the structure from now on has been to continue this process with Citizen Sleeper 2. We've now had 2 million players across the series. We put this out just recently on the anniversary. And also on the anniversary, which was May 5th, we did the first Citizen Sleeper Day. There's also another famous day on May the 4th, but we ignore that one. And you know, I put out this free tabletop game, which literally is I made it in like 2 weeks, but you know, it's really small and it's really, you know, it's for free and but the process for me has been to continue this process of trying to think about Citizen Sleeper as something which is shared with people who play it, that I'm listening to what people are saying about it, I'm seeing the response, and we're trying to continue to respond. I'm not going to make another Citizen Sleeper video game. The next big Citizen Sleeper project is a tabletop game, and I am working on another video game. But for me, I've seen, you know, with Citizen Sleeper 1, we had such a huge response, and so many people took it very generously to be very connected to them and their experiences. And so as I continue to work on the series, my intent is to keep it open and to open it up to provide tabletop role-playing games and wider spaces where people can tell their own stories within Citizen Sleeper as well. And you know, this has been a process of kind of me taking my fingers a little bit off the controls, hopefully, as the series goes forward. And I think that's it, probably. Yeah, that's the end. I have no idea what time it is, but I'm sure I have time for questions. Yeah? Okay.
Hello, Gareth.
Hello.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to applaud you for this game. It's an amazing piece of work.
Thank you.
And let me find my question. I'll write it down. You mentioned several times things about TTRPGs, and you mentioned Blades in the Dark, amazing game. As a DM and a game maker myself too, I really admire the philosophy of failure as driving the plot forward. And I would like to ask, how did it feel in your experience to plan a game with so many failed states when there are chances for a player to just stumble into a critically bad choice and then make the plot crash down in such an open narrative?
Yeah, it's an absolute nightmare.
Checks out.
One of the biggest challenges of Citizen Sleeper is that if at the end, if a player just fails, usually in a video game, it's very normal to just say, no, that didn't happen. Like, come back with me to this checkpoint. Okay, let's try again, right? When you commit to not doing that, you weave so much of the things that you rely on to make a video game. And so having this thing where it's like, okay, you failed, but the story keeps going, it creates so many complications and problems. I think for me, it was a real challenge in Citizen Sleeper 2 to actually just test myself to opening up this space. And I think the main thing is that I stopped thinking about punishing the player. I think so many times when we're making games, we're thinking about, okay, if they do something wrong, what do they get punished with? Like, how do I slap them on the wrist? And I started thinking about it being a journey instead, and this experience of, okay, I actually want the player to fail, so that when they succeed, it means something, you know? And then it stopped being about, like, punishing the player, and it started being about supporting them. I think there's an expression you probably know if you're a DM, which is comes with another DMing principle, which is being a fan of the players. And for me, I'm always thinking about that in my video games is, how can I make sure that I'm showing the player I'm a fan of them, even if they get themselves down in this terrible hole, you know? With Citizen Sleeper 2, it's totally possible to end up in a totally crazy hole, but I really challenged myself to try to make that interesting and an exciting experience, and I hope that I succeeded, but it is very, very hard, and I'm very sure there are points where there are some players who just fall down a hole and then just turn off the game. But yeah, that was a challenge I set myself.
Thank you, mate.
Thank you.
Hey, hi.
Hey, Jody.
I'm really curious about the narrative design of the crew system, because I was fascinated by how you can take anyone to any contract and they would just say their piece. Did you just brute force that? Just wrote a variation for every crew member, or how do you go about it?
Yeah, I did to some extent, but I used Ink for the back end of the game, and Ink has this really amazing capability. If anybody who doesn't know, Ink is a kind of scripting language created by the studio Inkle, and it allows me to check if a player has seen any previous section of text, anything at all. And you can use that for a huge amount of things. And because of this, I create this separation where, the game knows some things and the narrative scenes know other things. And I don't always need those two things to connect. So in a way, it means that I can, this is quite technical, but I can kind of queue up a scene, let's say, and that scene can adapt itself to the player without ever checking the game state, like what's happening in the game, what's happened. It can check just what's happened through the narrative. So that allows me a lot more flexibility, because if I just decide like, oh, it would be cool in this scene to have, if you brought Bliss along, to have this happen, I can really clearly like go back and check through my work and say, oh, look, there's this paragraph where this is you hiring Bliss. Okay, let's check if they've seen that. If they've seen that, I know they've hired that. So yeah, there's ways of doing it, and that's the main way I do it. But yeah, it was a lot of brute force. The game has 250,000 words. Oh, wow. So.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thanks for the
Hi.
talk and congrats for both amazing games. I was just curious, you were mentioning that you wanted Citizen Sleeper 2 to be like a sort of a, like, I know. I was just curious, you were mentioning that you wanted Citizen Sleeper 2 to be like sort of a sequel of like a TV show, that you had like the tools there, like the ideas there, but also mentioned that Citizen Sleeper 1 was just like the tip of the iceberg. That was you like your first approach to these ideas and like bringing tabletop stuff to video games. Did you notice, or did you have to make like any shift on your tool set or like your workflow to bring that to Citizen Sleeper 2?
So the really fun thing I think about making the sequel in this way was that I'd made 3 DLC episodes in Citizen Sleeper 1, and so I'd actually, I made those really fast. I mean, they're only an hour of content each, but I made that within a year, and that meant having tools in the back end, which allowed me to work to create game content really fast. So when I got to the sequel, I already had this very efficient system, and actually what I did to test some of the additions to Citizen Sleeper 2, I implemented them in Citizen Sleeper 1. Like I implemented the dice system from Citizen Sleeper 2 in Citizen Sleeper 1, just because I had a whole game that I could play and see if it worked. And so building on top of it was really good. But I would say that like there are dangers to that. It was the game is very messy in the end, I would say. Like QA was a nightmare because it was a game which is built entirely on top of another game, right? And so if you were planning to make like Citizen Sleeper 3 and 4 and 5, then maybe you wouldn't want to do that. But because, like you said, I wanted it to be the second season, I built it around this structure of trying to achieve it quickly and therefore building on what I already had.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you for your talk, Gareth.
Thank
it was
you.
Really interesting. I had a question about all this massive work you put into your games in so different areas. How do you manage to organize yourself, especially when you have to do things like the writing and the designing of the game? How do you organize yourself through all this process?
Yeah, like I was kind of hinting at the beginning, I guess, I have these like this way of working where I try to be kind to my creative self by doing work with my kind of administrative self. I think the hardest thing I discovered about making video games is getting up on Monday morning and thinking, what do I need to do today to release this game in 2 years' time? It's absolute psychic pain, you know? You immediately go back to bed. So what I realized is I need to, once a week, once a month, continually be feeding my creative self tasks to do. And knowing that on Monday morning when I get up, I make my coffee and I look at the screen, I have these 3 things, 4 things, 5 things to do. And if I do those today, that's today done, I did my day, that's good. If I finish them early, that's great. If I didn't do one of them, I move it to another day. But every single task has to happen on a day. I think it's such a curse to have one of those to-do lists written on a long piece of paper, and you're always scrubbing things out and always adding things. And the to-do list never gets shorter and it never changes. You never feel any progress. So for me, it's about creating a structure. And that structure might not work for other people, but it's about, over the years of making games solo, I've learned to pay attention to my own rhythms and finding ways to be kind to myself, you know, and to never work in debt, never work behind a deadline. If I miss the deadline, I replan. Things like this. This is the only way that I can kind of work. So yeah, that's the main thing.
But did you do all kind of creative tasks at the same time? Like you were writing at the same time you were designing to change that?
The joy of working solo is you can be like, you can just change all the time. You can be like, okay, I'm halfway through making this contract, but actually I really need to go write this scene and I'm going to go write it. And it's a massive advantage because when you're a big team, you can't do that at all. So yeah, for me, it's a balance of allowing myself to make things when they are the most present in my mind. You know, if I've been thinking about a scene all weekend, then I should write it on Monday. You know, it's not that I only have to do those 5 things. I can move those. So you know, I'm trying to listen to myself in that way. But yeah, for me, it gets chunked up into bits and pieces, and you definitely have to try to have, I think, as few changeovers as possible, right? In a day, I would never plan to be writing scenes and then programming new features, you know, in the same day. So in general, I would try to keep the hat changing to a minimum, basically.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
You did mention that you fought against the power fantasy to prevent people just steamroll through the game. Can you say more about how you did, why, and the aftermath of that on production?
In what sense on production? You mean in terms of the time it took to make the game?
No, in what decisions happened of that thing you did?
I mean, I guess yeah, it's tricky because it's very connected to Citizen Sleeper 1 and how Citizen Sleeper 1 was already trying to do this. I think, you know, playing against it just was a rule, I guess, that I followed, you know, throughout when I was making, because the game takes place in these hubs and then contracts. In the contracts, they always had to have this failure possibility, and that was just baked in from the start. So it did create this significant impact on the structure of the game, but it was inherent to the structure of the game. I think you know, for me, just rejecting a power fantasy is just, in a way, like all of my games, I always have this idea of the player has to be different. You know, the player knows they're not an NPC. They know they have different powers. But the gambit I'm trying to make is that the player is different in maybe a bad way, or in a way they feel that is not giving them an advantage. It's not giving them a power fantasy. So, like when you're the sleeper in Citizen Sleeper, other people look at you and they think you're strange and maybe dangerous, and your body's falling apart, and you have all of these tensions, and that's what makes you different. So, for me, it's hard because for this game specifically, because it's just generally part of my wider ethos when I'm making my games, I guess, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Right. Hi. Incredible games. I think you've created beautiful science fiction. The themes that you talk about and explore in the games are very interesting, very rich. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Ask you, where do you get all these? What inspires you? What kinds of media do you immerse yourself in, because it's very rich?
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, everything, I guess. It's not a very helpful answer, but I think I'm first and foremost, I think I have the mentality of a writer, And I think the mentality of a writer is to be always curious about the world and about people. And so that's my first port of call for all of my work is situations, people reading about the world, trying to understand, especially considering why people do the things they do. For me, is one of the big challenges as a human, is to try to understand other people's actions. And I think as a writer, it's 100% necessary because you can't possibly begin to write a character without understanding why they're behaving the way they are. And so that's the first point. I think then, just in terms of media, I guess that, I am very omnivorous because I like to find things that are interesting in things that are not interesting, which maybe comes from my history of playing games, because when you play AAA games sometimes, it's a lot of things which are not interesting, but there's maybe like one really, really amazing idea in there. And so I actually think that the way I consume things generally and they feed me is by me finding what is meaningful to me in each thing. So I try not to worry too much about what makes this great, but I'm thinking more about what can I find that I can draw on and that gives me power. And especially when I'm making my games, I surround myself with like little reminders of that. So I often print out, I print a lot of postcards of like shots from movies and things because I have a terrible memory. So it's just helpful when I see them at the edge of my screen, like, okay, that bit was really good. And I know that if I look away from my screen for an idea, I will immediately look at this tapestry of things, and then maybe I'm going to find something there. So for me, it's about finding all of these waypoints around the project, right? And these describe the project somehow. If you have enough of them, you know exactly what's in the project and what's outside, and that's what I try to build. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you.
I think there's a guy at the back.
Hello. Thank you for your games. I love them.
Thank you.
I think this question may be more related to In Other Waters or Citizen Sleeper 1, because I'm very curious about how you prototype being like those text-driven games. If you make like, I don't know, like story in ink, the tool, and then you add like the, let's say, a gameplay layer on top of that. And then also like Citizen Sleeper is so centered, like driven by dice. So if you took advantage of that to like prototype on like pen and paper or like on board.
Yeah, totally. I mean, In Other Waters and Citizen Sleeper were prototyped in quite different ways. I actually prototyped In Other Waters in Twine, which is like a text engine. And it began life as just a text choice game. And then I slowly started to introduce ideas on top of that. But I think in a way that's not always the most helpful thing, because for my games, I know in a way that the text will come and what it will be. For me, I'm interested in the mechanical side. So for Citizen Sleeper, actually, I just had a load of index cards with like clocks drawn on them, and I started rolling dice and just seeing like, what does it feel like? What's the progression like? What pacing works? And I think the first time I ever rolled like 5 ones, I was like, this game's going to work, because it felt so shit. It was just like, oh my God, this perfectly represents the feeling of waking up and just being like, I want to go back to bed. Nothing good is going to happen today. So that's when I was like, okay. So I guess I do a lot of paper prototyping, but I'm always trying to think about that emotional question of like, what's the experience, not necessarily just how does the economy work or things like this, which is my secondary focus.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
¿Alguien más?
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, and congrats for your game. I'm currently playing the first one, and I'm loving it. I have a question because I'm playing the one with a fan translation to Spanish.
Okay.
What do you think about fan translation, and have you have any thought of translating your games?
Yeah, fan translation is really tricky, I think, for my games because of the volume of text and the importance of the text. I guess that's why I haven't really, I don't have a problem with people doing it, obviously. It's very, it's a real compliment, that somebody wants to spend their time doing that. I think it's just that, for me, I can't possibly put my name to something when I don't have full confidence that the writing is represented, and the writing is so important to me that I work very closely with the translators that I work with. For example, the translator for Japanese that I use translated all of my games, and it's only one translator who does the entire game, which is quite rare. And so, yeah, for me, it's a big process, and it's a very expensive process. So I think fan translations are fantastic and really lovely, but there's no way for me to kind of bring them into what I put out, I think.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your games. I really love them.
Thank you.
So my question is related to art. I think both Citizen Sleeper 1, In Other Waters, and Citizen Sleeper 2 are very memorable in terms of UI and graphic design. So I was wondering if you have like a background in graphic design, where do you take inspiration from? Because they are stuck in my head, like their graphic design, their visuals, they are very cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely do. I think I taught myself like Photoshop with like cracked Photoshop at about 13, and I've worked as a video and designer. I did a lot of work as doing pre-visualization as a designer. So before I started video games, I didn't start making video games till I was 30. I'll let you guess how old I am. The process I was doing was mostly being brought in by design studios to establish the identity and the pre-visualization of projects. They could be, projection projects, could be theater projects, all kinds of projects. And so I think I really cut my teeth with learning how to make a distinct identity for something. And I think that's what I really saw in indie games when I made In Other Waters, is that as someone who was, at the time I was doing a PhD in literature, and so as someone who's a writer and also had this experience with visual design, I thought those two things together would be enough, I don't program and I had to use visual scripting, but that was the real connection. So for me, that's the most exciting thing. Often when I'm working, like I designed the logo for my next game halfway through the development of Citizen Sleeper 2, just for fun. So for me, that identity side of the game and the visual identity and working on these projects, we did this new art for the games together. That really gives me a lot of life and energy. It's just something I find a lot of joy in. So I have a background in it, but it's also just, I always get excited about thinking about what are the colors, what are the shapes, what's the world that I can describe with the graphic design.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Gareth.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the talk. I really haven't played your game, sorry, but I know you for your work as an essayist, for your work in Heterotopia. I wanted to ask you, because you were working a lot in these more theoretical areas, and now you have turned into a production of video games. Could you talk a little bit about what this kind of theoretical work gives you as a game developer? Like what kind of abilities you acquire, or how it strengthens your vision of the design? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think that's been the core of me starting making games when I was 30, is that I'd been, so if people don't know, I run this project called Heterotopias, which is about games and architecture, and it's focused on exploring the kind of ideological and like philosophical meanings of spaces in games. And I think, I was also working as a games critic for a long time and wrote about games a lot. I think this kind of gathering of references was incredibly important. And just like that's the first advice to any writer, is to read. I think really for game designers, there's nothing better than playing games, just huge amounts of, you don't have to play 100 hours. In fact, don't play 100 hours of something. Play 1 hour of everything, And this is a habit I picked up as a games critic and writing theoretically and trying to find, when you're writing about games, you get that instinct of you play a game and you're looking for where's the thing that catches you, the thing you're going to write about when you have to write the article. What's interesting there? And I think that's a really good habit to get into as a game designer as well, is to play games and think about what's interesting there. So for me, it was really natural that fed into my work. And I think, in terms of heterotopias and architecture and game spaces, I think that's something I want to try to explore more in future and make games with 3D spaces and try to think about that side of games as well, because that's part of my work that's not yet really appeared in my games, but I have done a lot of thinking and work around. So I think it will continue to feed me.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a wrap.
I think we're good. I'm free. How many hours has it been?
Applause, maybe.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.